Welcome to the Great War Discussion Group. It is the presenter this time is Michael Burke, and the topic is going to be the peculiar relationship between Africa and France during World War I. France still has an interesting relationship with its former African colonies, I should say, and that many aspects of that relationship are shown in what occurred during World War I. We have several pictures in the Museum of African Troops that are fighting on the Western Front, and most of them, in fact, are French. So Mike is well known to all of you, and Mike, it's your conference.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Charlie, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining me today. As Charlie said, I'm going to talk a little bit about African support to France. The reason I chose this topic is because I really could not do it justice during my presentation in April about World War I in Africa. And it was just something that I found interesting, and so I thought I would go do a separate presentation on it. So about 8 million Frenchmen will serve in the army during the First World War. About 7 million of them will serve in one of the various locations where the French army fought. About 1.4 million French soldiers will die during the war, and another 1 million will suffer casualties, will become casualties. One of the sources that I looked at identified that for every day of the war, over 900 Frenchmen will die in support of their efforts. Now, of that 1 million, 1.4 million that died in the war, 71,000, or a little bit more than 71,000, will be African soldiers from both North and West Africa. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to also talk about this particular subject. So this is how the discussion or my presentation is laid out. And again, I'm really just going to talk about West Africa and North Africa soldiers. If you had the opportunity to sit in on my presentation in April, you know that I like to use pop quizzes. This is no different. I've got several questions I'm going to throw out there. I would ask that you use the chat function to go ahead and, if you know the answer to the question, go ahead and type it in the chat. That way all of us can see the response at the same time, and then we're not fighting to talk over each other on the audio. So if you've studied, hopefully you've studied, and so here comes your first question. So on this postcard, which group of French soldiers are from Africa? You know the answer is, type it in there. All right, give it another bit. All right, so essentially there are 5 of the soldiers on this postcard are from Africa, and they are these 5 right here. I had a follow-on question, which I think I'll just answer myself. How many of these Africans are from West Africa? And the answer is that soldier there, the Trillier Senegalese, which means then the other 4 are from North Africa. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these groups of African, these different formations a little bit later on in the presentation. So with that, let's go ahead and go into the quick historical review. Obviously, don't have a lot of time to talk about everything. I tried to condense it to just what you'll see here. And with that, let's go ahead and get into North Africa. So North Africa, the indigenous people of North Africa before the Arab expansion were called Berbers. And still they're the indigenous folks that are there, although they were eventually conquered by the Arabs. North Africa has been important for history for thousands of years. Once men could learn how to sail in ships, and they knew that 6 months out of the year the wind blew to the west, and then the other 6 months of the year the wind blew back to the east. They came out of the Eastern Mediterranean, making stops along North African shores, putting in for resupplies, trading with the Berbers, and then moving a little bit further west. And so the history there is really quite quite extensive. And then if you look at it, if you add into the movement across the Sahara, which begins about 1 million AD, with the introduction of camels, exploration between or trade between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa also makes North Africa important. And so again, it's a lot of different cultures, a lot of different influences across throughout North Africa. The actual introduction or the movement of Arabs into North Africa, it's going to take them about 62 years to actually conquer all of North Africa, with the first invasion beginning in about 647. And they're going to come out of Egypt and they're going to move across present-day Libya, and they're going to attack or try to conquer Byzantine outposts that are located in current-day Tunisia. And it actually goes fairly well for the Arabs until a revolt or insurrection led by folks back in the Middle East causes the leader to turn around and go back into Egypt and back through Egypt into present-day Middle East to go ahead and put down that insurrection. The second invasion occurs between 655 and 689. They continue to move through Tunisia. They actually kind of move along to the border in Algeria, but another insurrection back in the Middle East causes the Sultan to turn around and go back into the Middle East in order to put down an insurrection. And then the final conquest occurs about 700 AD. And by that time, Constantinople is no longer able to protect its territory here in the West. And the Arabs are able to push all the way across, all the way into Morocco. And so by 709, the Arabs have taken over control of North Africa, which is okay. I mean, that's kind of what they want to do. Later on, obviously, they threaten Spain. They entered Spain and threaten the rest of Europe. But that's a topic for another day. The French actually show up in North Africa about 1830, when they, between 1830 and 1847, they're going to go ahead and take over all of Algeria. It's going to be use of French forces from the mainland are going to come in. They're going to essentially beat back the Arab soldiers and the Berber and their Berber soldiers as well. And they're going to go ahead and occupy all of Algeria. About 1844, the French are going to try to move into Morocco and seize that, but they're not going to be very successful. And the Moroccans are going to kind of hold them off for a couple of years. The French kind of bide their time, and in early about 1905, they actually are able to go ahead and begin to maintain or exert control over all of Morocco. And so there's actually two Moroccan crises. One with the first one, 1905 to 1906, and the second one is 1907 to 1918. And Europe almost goes to war during that second Moroccan crisis when the Kaiser sends a gunship to essentially threaten the French as they're moving their forces through the Atlantic Ocean into Morocco. But by 1911, they signed a treaty, and France now controls all of Algeria and all of Morocco. And then in 1881, France eyes Tunisia. Italy also has designs on Tunisia, but their military is not sufficient to go ahead and beat back the French. And so, and of course, also by that time, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, known as the sick man of Europe, is no longer able to defend itself. And so the French sent a military, naval and ground force, eventually beat back the Ottoman Turks. And by 1881, France controls all of North Africa from Tunisia to Morocco. And so that's kind of how the French get there. Shift a little bit to West Africa. If you remember from my previous presentation, long before the Europeans ever turned their eyes towards Africa, there were many different kind of kingdoms. This map again talks to some of the larger kingdoms that existed long before the French turned up. Initially, European exploration they're looking for a route from Europe to China. And so they stop along the coast looking for food and water, but for the most part, they're unable to penetrate into Africa because the diseases and what they find inside of that. It's really not until the early part of the 18th or 19th century where Europeans essentially are having conquered most of the rest of the world or colonized most of the rest of the world, turn their interest to Africa proper itself. Africa had resources which the Europeans needed. So they had actually Africans, which were then sold off into slavery, which kind of goes to the New World to produce resources, which are taken back to Europe. They produce goods, which are then sent back to Africa. So you've got the triangular trade route between Europe, Africa, and the New World. And then essentially, kind of like the French interest in North Africa, along about the 1840s, France becomes interested in West Africa. They establish a port called St. Louis. It's located in, or St. Louis. It is located in Senegal. And really, the French were not that interested in slavery. They had lost most of their colonies. If you remember, Napoleon gave up the Louisiana Purchase to America. They really didn't have a whole lot going on. They were actually more interested in the produce or the what they could go ahead and export: the ground nuts, peanuts, palm oil, and the like, which they needed for their industry. And so, essentially, by 1840, again, they've into Senegal. They begin westward expansion. They begin to move further westward in the present day Mauritania, Mali, Niger, with Mali and Niger, which are all French colonies. And again, they're essentially establishing control over their colonies. Now, one of the things that they will do, both in North Africa as well as in West Africa, is that they're going to go ahead and create army units made out of local populace. It saves them money because they don't have to pay the African soldiers as much as they have to pay the French soldiers. African soldiers are familiar with the area. They're immune to most of the diseases. They know the territory. They can speak the languages of the people in the area. And it's kind of cynical in many ways, but if there's a lot of African casualties, the people back in France are not really going to pay much attention to the number of African soldiers that may be killed in an engagement. We then get into what we've already talked about before, which is the scramble for Africa. As the available territory in the world shrinks, everybody starts traveling to Africa, and it kind of is a little bit messy in most places. It's not until the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885 that the Europeans will sit down at a table from November of 1884 until February of 1885, and this is where they carve up the African continent. And they establish spheres of influence or areas that belong to one particular country over another. I was looking for where the term scramble for Africa occurs, and it's actually mentioned in 1884, just before the Berlin Conference, by the Times in Britain. They're the ones who coined the term scramble for Africa. And as you know, essentially they carve up the continent. You've got German spheres of influence, British spheres of influence, French spheres of influence, and so forth. And so it's again, the Berlin Conference, it kind of sets the stage for how Africa approaches the support for World War I. All right, so with our history established, I know I've gone through pretty quick, but with the history established, let's go ahead and move on to our next question. And here it is. So which French unit was the most decorated during this war? And again, you use your chat function. It's the Moroccan division. So essentially, the Moroccan division is going to fight in just about every major battle that the French army fights from 1914 all the way through 1918. Every regiment of this division and the division itself will receive the Legion of Honor. So it becomes the most decorated French unit or French army unit throughout the war. And kind of mentioned the fact that it was not uncommon for the French to use colonial soldiers in their various wars. And so most of the units that I'm going to talk about were created 1830, 1840s, but they're going to fight with the French in the Crimean War, 1853, 1856, in the Italian War in 1859. They will be involved in the invasion of Mexico in the 1860s, the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, 1871, and the Sino-French War of 1885, as well as they're going to provide occupation troops in Morocco, in Algeria, in Tunisia. So the French are going to use North Africans and West Africans to also help them police up their colonies. And so again, it wasn't unknown for colonial forces to fight with the French army. Right, so let's move on and talk a little bit about specific North African soldiers. So the Spahi, were the light cavalry. They were immediately deployed in 1914 to France, and they served as most cavalry in the initial stages of the war, flanking operations, screening operations, securing lines of communication. But as the war goes into a war of stagnation, where we get into the war of the trenches, like most cavalry units, they will be withdrawn from the front, and they will be pulled back to you for different sort of missions. They will be detached. They will detach a squadron back to Palestine, so they're going to fight against the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And then by the time that the Allied offensive of 1918, they'll bring back cavalry. And so this is actually a photograph of these are German prisoners captured in June or July of 1918. So they're going to be involved in performing the missions of cavalry units. Oh, got chat. I have annoying feedback on my mic. Okay. Sorry, let me see if I can move it closer and maybe I'll make it a little less annoying. Excuse me. Hopefully this is a little bit better. Next unit we talk about were the Chasseurs d'Afrique, another light cavalry unit. They were predominantly made up of soldiers from Algeria. Just like the Spahis, they will be deployed to Europe in 1914, and just like them, by the end of at the end of 1914, they'll be withdrawn and send their missions elsewhere. They're going to fight in the Middle East against the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and then a squadron will also serve in the Balkans, because remember they were fighting in the Balkans as well. Mostly individuals from Algeria, both Algerians as well as Frenchmen who might have moved to Algeria, became business people, and then they wanted to join the military. They served in this unit as well. Next one is the Trillier, or the Trox, but Trillier Algerian. Again, mostly Algerian soldiers, led by French officers. They were formed in 1842. Prior to World War I, their most notable conflict will be the Mexican invasion of Mexico that France does, and the Battle of San Lorenzo, where they are going to, the regiments will be awarded the Legion of Honor for their actions on that date. Eventually, they're going to go ahead and serve throughout all the areas where French soldiers are fighting, and by the end of the war, there'll be over 33,000 Trillier Algerians fighting in the war. And the last group are the Zouaves. This is a light infantry unit. They're made up of folks from Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. These were, again, a non-integrated unit. So you see the photograph here of a French officer who is leading his Zouaves. They were known for their colorful uniform. It doesn't show it in this, but they wore a red fez. They had a bright blue sash. Sorry. They also had a blue jacket, and then these pants were actually were bright red. And so you can imagine, as they marched off to the Western Front in 1914, they were easily picked up by German artillery and machine gunners. And so, like the rest of the French army, the early part of 1915, they get out of this colorful uniform and they go into a more dusty, a more less hard to see sort of uniform. One of the things I noticed that I thought was interesting as I was looking through this subject is that there will be Zouave units that fight during our Civil War. So there'll be Northern Zouave units and there'll be Southern Zouave units, and they all wore the same sort of colorful uniforms during our Civil War as well. The other thing I thought was kind of interesting is that as I mentioned in the introduction to the presentation that you saw online, the first French unit to be gassed during the First World War will be the 45th Division, which was made up of colonial forces from um, Algeria as well as Martinique. And that'll be in the first Battle of Ypres in April of 1915. Right, next question, which I'll probably go through pretty quickly, but has anybody ever heard of something called banania? I hadn't, and so I ended up having to look it up. But banania is a drink. It's a chocolate drink that was prevalent. I think it's still prevalent today, though they don't call it banania anymore. And this is how they advertised it prior to and at the beginning of the First World War. This is a West African soldier in his traditional garb. And he's essentially, drinking his hot cup of chocolate, which was given to soldiers on the Western Front throughout the war. And this then became the face of this product because of the popularity of West African soldiers in the French society leading up to and through the First World War. Obviously, over time, this particular soldier, not caricature, but the use of the soldier was considered to be both colonial and racist. And so over time, they eventually changed their branding and they took the West African soldier off the logo. All right, so with that, we can get into West African soldiers. And so they're the Trilliers Senegalese. And so initially formed in, I want to say 1857, they came from Africans who lived in Senegal. But over time, they eventually began to contain or enlist soldiers from Mauritania, Mali, Niger, and further into Central Africa. I've already mentioned why they recruited Africans into the military for the disease. They were able to overcome the diseases. They knew the languages. They knew the terrain, and so that's one of the reasons why this unit grows very large. I mean, there's a lot of I have another slide that talks about the numbers, but there'll be a lot of West Africans who are voluntold or conscripted into the French army. They talked about how each ethnic group or tribe was required to go ahead and cough up a certain number of individuals to serve in the military. So sometimes they were the brave ones, and sometimes they were the sick and lame that kind of got foisted off into serving in the army. As we get into talk a little bit more about where they're employed in West Africa, the French really believed that their Africans, especially the West Africans, were exceptionally fierce warriors. And so they wanted to use African soldiers in France. They wanted to use African soldiers in their other campaigns as well. But they wanted to do that because they were different than other European soldiers. And so the use of Africans in the French army was designed to kind of, to use them because they were part of the French army, but the other was to kind of strike fear into their adversaries. And I will talk a little bit about that a little later on and the results of that. But the Trilliers Senegalese were mentioned in dispatches during the part of the Dardanelles or the Gallipoli campaign, where they deployed with the other French forces to support Churchill's attempt to secure the Bosphorus and the Strait of Dardanelles. We had about 161,000 we recruited, and they really don't know how many died, but essentially it was well over 30,000. Like the Algerian light infantry, initially the Troc Senegalese were black soldiers with white officers, but by the spring of 1915, they integrated colonial soldiers into other units, and so you can see white soldiers serving along with the black soldiers as well. Getting back to that, the terror that African soldiers struck into the hearts of the Germans. The Germans actually protested the use of African soldiers. They thought they were extremely too brutal. They accused them of war crimes, murdering wounded soldiers, wounding and killing POWs. A lot of Africans carried very long knives, which they used to supposedly slice off the ears and the noses of German casualties. None of which I didn't see any truth to that, though it probably did occur. And And essentially, the use of African soldiers is going to cause a problem for the French a little bit later on, after the end of the war. And again, I'll talk about that as we get into it a little bit later. So North and West Africans are going to travel to France as soldiers, but the French are also going to bring in Africans to help them support the war effort. And so about 220,000 Africans are going to travel and serve as workers. They work as stevedores, so they're going to load and unload ships. They're going to load and unload railroad cars. They're going to build railroad lines. They're going to repair railroad lines. They're going to serve as factory workers. They're going to plant the crops. They're going to tend the crops. They're going to go ahead and harvest the crops. But essentially, they're going to do all of the jobs that normally would be done by Frenchmen who are currently serving in the army. While serving in France or while living in France, they're going to be treated. Some are going to be treated very poorly. Some are going to be treated a little bit better than that. They're going to face racism. Again, most French men, French women hadn't seen an Africans. All they knew is about Africans, what they had read or heard about. And so they'll be treated fairly badly for most part. They're going to be treated as if they were soldiers. So they're going to be segregated from the French populace. They'll be living in barracks. They're going to be treated with discipline. They're going to be essentially try to limit the interaction between these African laborers and the French population, which is not going to work out. But again, the goal was to keep them separated. And then as soon as the war was over, within about 7 months, almost every one of those 220,000 laborers were sent back home. The idea was that they wanted them back out of France. They needed the jobs. I mean, as French soldiers are being demobilized, the French government wants to put the French soldiers back to work. And so the best way to do that is to go ahead and to send all of these French laborers back as soon as possible. So they're going to serve France. They're going to do the heavy lifting, the heavy labor. But as soon as the war is over, they're going to go and be sent back home. Next question. In addition to Africa, where else did France bring laborers from? Yeah, so the answer is Asia. And so as the slides here, about 49,000 plus or minus are going to come from Vietnam, and about 140 are going to come from China. Now, the asterisk is there because only about 37,000 Chinese are going to serve in France. The other 94 plus, the British are going to take and put them to work in England. And so you see on the top, those are Vietnamese laborers. They're working on the train yards, taking their break. And then on the bottom photograph, those are Chinese workers who are in a munition factory. And if my memory serves me correct, I think they're working on fuses. And so Asia is going to send a lot of laborers. Again, when the empire went to war, all of its colonies or all of its members of the state were expected to participate and support the war effort as well. I don't have a question for this one, but some of you, I mean, all of you are probably familiar with Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is going to end up in France in 1919. He leaves Vietnam in 1911. He travels the world on ships. He's a cook aboard different kinds of ships. He actually spends time in New York as a cook. He makes his way to France by the end of the war. And he's serving as a cook in a hotel in Paris. And he actually, during that first meeting of the Versailles Peace, or during the Versailles Peace Conference, he actually gathers up several Vietnamese, and they go and they approach the French government asking for their independence. And then, as everybody knows, the French ignored them, which of course is going to come back and bite them in their fourth point of contact when they have to go ahead and defeat the Vietnamese forces under Ho Chi Minh. And by 1954, France is out of Africa. All right, next question. Anybody who speaks French know what the term hivernage mean? Hivernage is the French word for wintering. I found it really interesting. So West Africans especially, but also North Africans, could not stand the cold and the wet of the trenches on the Western Front. And so as the last of the summer offensives wound down, Africans would be taken from the battlefield and they would be sent somewhere to winter. And so a lot of them ended up wintering in Marseille, not a bad place for that. And actually, some of the African soldiers were taken back to Africa, where they would spend the winter recuperating, retraining, being prepared. And then when the springtime came, it became time for the next spring offensive. The Africans would be reintroduced into the trenches, and that became a signal to the French soldiers who had spent the winter in the trenches that that the next offensive was going to be about to begin, because the African soldiers were going to essentially become the first wave that went over the top at the beginning of that particular battle. As I mentioned earlier, African soldiers are going to serve in every major battle. I'm not going to describe each of these, but that I talked about the Moroccan division and how the Moroccan division was the most highly decorated, but they were mentioned in dispatches in the Marne, the Picardy, and the First Battle of Ypres. In the Dardanelles, the Senegalese will be involved in that, and also the Senegalese, the Trocs or the Trilliers Senegalese, are going to be feature high in the capture of Fort Douaumont during the Verdun. The Senegalese are also going to take heavy casualties during the Nivelle offensive for the battle for Champs-Élysées. And then all of the North Africans are going to be highly mentioned for their conduct in 1918 in the Battle of Reims and the Second Battle of the Marne. And so, and as I mentioned earlier, they're going to fight in the Middle East, they're going to fight in the Balkans, they're going to fight wherever France needs them. These North Africans and African soldiers are going to deploy in order to support the French military. All right, next question. Anybody want to hazard a guess why the 157th Division was called the Red Hand Division? Well, to be honest with you, I don't know either, because I could not figure out why it was called the Red Hand Division. But early in the war, this is the flag for the division, they actually had a red hand. So I'm assuming that somewhere in its history, a dying commander whose hand was covered in blood put his hand on the division colors, and it became part of the division flag. You'll notice the American flag here. And so the 93rd Division, the Harlem Hellfighters, were actually given or assigned to the 157th Division for both training, and then later in 1918, as we go into the Allied offensive of the summer, they're going to fight alongside the 157th during all of the major battles that division will fight. And so after the end of the war, the 157th, the commander wanted to honor the American soldiers, and so he adds the American flag to the upper right-hand corner of their division colors. Right, so that kind of leads us into a discussion about the American connection. I'm going to talk a little bit about these photographs. I wrote in my notes in those halcyon days when we used to conduct tours, but you should be able to recognize the photograph in the upper right-hand corner. Now, that is in the West Gallery, and that the over the top gallery, actually, in the Western Corps, and that is soldiers of the 369th Regiment, who of the 93rd Division, which in this case they're training with the French division. And I like to point out to visitors when I'm talking about this photograph that a easy recognizable way to say that they were fighting with the French is because they're wearing the French helmets and not American helmets. So they're wearing the Adrian helmet. Photograph on the bottom, again, is of the same regiment after the war. Again, while they were training with and fighting with the French, they wore French helmets. They used the French machine guns. They used the French artillery. And so that is one of the reasons why the 93rd is called the Blue Helmet Division, because of the Adrian helmets that they wore during and I'm probably mispronouncing it, but the Adrian helmets, the French helmets that they wore during the war. And then that photograph in the upper left is the same unit after the war, receiving the Croix de Guerre with palm, but they've been put back into the American equipment. So they're wearing their tin pots and their overcoats and their American rifles, that kind of thing. I think we're all aware of the fact that Pershing was under pressure to go ahead and put American forces with both British and French units. He acquiesced. He said, Americans to be trained in British schools. He said Americans to be trained in French schools. Some British unit, some American units will fight alongside the British, and then, as I've already described, a lot of them, several American units will also serve alongside French units. And so we have that connection. I also say it's interesting that if you look at the photograph in the upper right, if you go to that gallery, so here you have the sons of freed slaves, American slaves, who will then fight alongside maybe their West African brothers from, depending on where they came from, fighting alongside them in France, in support of France during the First World War. I think it's kind of an interesting connection. All right, got another quiz. Somebody who speaks German, everybody know what that Schwarze Schmuck means? Schwarze is black, so we got that first word. Everybody know what Schmuck means? All right, it's black shame. And so it becomes kind of a, not to be redundant or trite, it becomes a black mark or a bad situation that occurs in Germany. So as I mentioned, when the war ends, obviously the Allies are going to occupy Germany. France makes the decision to begin demobilizing most of its soldiers so they can go back to work in France. And so they're going to turn to the colonial forces to serve as the occupation troops in Germany. And so about 25,000 colonial troops are going to be serving as occupation forces in Germany. They're going to be serving in the Rhine region, or the Ruhr River Valley area along the Rhine. And so as Germany's dealing with the aftermath of the war, before they, the series of governments that come to power, they want to kind of deflect from the results of the Treaty of Versailles and the occupation of the Ruhr River Valley, having to pay back the Allies for the cost of the war. And so they begin a series of attacks against these African soldiers. And so you can see the photograph on the left, there's a virginal Rhine River maiden who's being carried off by an African soldier depicted as a gorilla. There'll be stories of rape and murder. They're going to go ahead and attempt to divert the public's attention from what's going on in the country. And it really comes to for 1920, 1921. By the end of 1921, the French begin to withdraw African soldiers, colonial soldiers, and so it no longer becomes a talking point for the politicians and the people in Germany. Some of the unfortunate results of this is that some German women will have children from African soldiers, and so you're going to have these mixed race children that are growing up in the Ruhr River Valley. When the Nazis come to power and they publish the race laws, they actually go about sterilizing all of the mothers as well as all of the children that are the result of having African fathers. And so they will all be sterilized. Some of them will end up in concentration camps. Now, the other thing that occurs, again, with the rise of the Nazi Party, is that when France falls in 1940, the Wehrmacht will begin to murder every African soldier that they capture, because going back to the Schwarze Schmacht and the ill feeling that they have towards African soldiers. And so the massacre of African soldiers at the beginning of the occupation of France is also kind of a direct result from what happened here during the First World War. So let's talk a little bit about the aftermath, all right? So some speculation that the Africans were used as cannon fodder. And so there's actually a letter written by a French colonel in 1918, which kind of alludes to the fact that Africans should be put into the first line of battle so that we can save our Frenchmen, our white soldiers, for the follow-on battles. A lot of it, I found it fairly interesting. I don't do numbers, but it was kind of an interesting article that talked about the statistics of French units and how many killed, how many missing, how many wounded. And quite frankly, most of the African units, really, those units that had African soldiers, really didn't have much and many more casualties than other French units. There's no data for, there's no data against. It just depends on how you want to make, how you want to use that the potential inference. Life after demobilization. So most African soldiers, when they finally got demobilized, 1920, 1921, they went home and they tried to just reconnect back to their lives. They wanted to talk about their experiences with their children and their grandchildren. They wanted to kind of get their jobs back if they had jobs, and they also wanted to collect their pensions because the French government had promised that they would pay them for their service. And so, not a lot of African soldiers who are pressing for independence. I mean, we're not going to see that until after the end of the Second World War. But essentially, most of the Africans kind of go back to living the life that they led prior to the war. But the French and the Africans will want to remember the service, the support that the Africans provided to France during the First World War. So that photograph in the upper left, that is the commemorative. That's the monument to the heroes of the Black Army, and it was, I want to say, it was created in. No, it doesn't really matter. It was created after the First World War. It was in Rennes. Interesting enough, after slaughtering all the African soldiers, the Wehrmacht essentially pulled the statue off of its pedestal. They put the statue on a train. They shipped it back to Germany, where it was lost for history, and then they demolished that base, essentially erasing any mention of African support to France during the First World War. In Africa, there were essentially two statues. The one in the upper right is called the Black Army, or the Army Noir. That is in Bamako in Mali. That's in the capital city. And then the one, sorry. The one on the bottom is called the Black Army, and that is in Dakar, Senegal. And that kind of had an interesting history. It was one of the traffic circles in Dakar after the war, when relations between Senegal and France didn't become very warm anymore. They actually took it, they put it in a cemetery. And then later, when relations between Senegal and France got warmer, they moved it back to a pedestal right outside the main train station in Dakar, Senegal. And the other one is the Demba and the Trillier, the Demba and the Dupont. Demba meaning Trillier, or the French, the African soldier, and Dupont means comrades, as the French one. And that is located in Mali. That photograph on the right side, that is the Grand Mosque in Paris. Since most of the North African and even West African soldiers were Muslims, France wanted to commemorate or honor their service. And so they created the Grand Mosque in Paris as a tribute to all of the Muslim, African, and other soldiers who came and fought with them as well. And so that is kind of how the Africans remember it, and it's kind of how the French are handling the remembrance of the First World War. Now we kind of made our way to the conclusion. So you got the cultural impact, economic consequences. Before the war, like I said, most Europeans hadn't seen an African, so they generally thought of them as savages. It kind of depends on your point of view. They were either savages or children that needed the enlightenment from the colonial powers. And so actually being able to interact with Africans throughout the war is going to change their opinion of Frenchmen, French women towards Africans. They're not going to make their lives any easier after the inter-year wars, but at least they're going to become a little bit more supportive of Africans because of the sacrifices that the Africans provided to the French. That photograph on the top is taken from a German POW camp, and it actually has Africans from across all of the colonies. And so you got Senegal on the upper level. You got from left to right Senegal, New Guinea, Somalia, Tunisia, and then on the bottom row you have Dahomey, which is Benin, Sudan, Vietnam, and then West Africa, and then those are the three along the bottom. So I thought that was kind of an interesting photograph. Here the Germans obviously are trying to make propaganda by showing Africans are captured in POWs. And then you got that photograph on the bottom. I think certainly a whole generation of French children would look kindly upon African soldiers for the support that they provided to France during the war. And in terms of the economic consequences, during the war, they needed a lot of the natural resources from Africa, so they were willing to pay top dollar for it. After the war, they became in charge again, and so they kind of started paying the bottom dollar for all of the things that they needed. Any opportunity for the Africans to start some sort of industrialization, making things so they can send it to France, they became flooded by cheaper goods that were made in France. So the economic consequences are essentially the Africans end up kind of going back to being an agrarian society. Right. Was there any one thing that you found interesting about this particular presentation? So kind of beginning to open it up for questions.
Mike?
Yes, sir.
One thing that to me is surprising is the support that they provided when they were actually dominated by France. Right after the war, they started to find ways to gain their independence. So how did they overcome that at the time of the war?
So thank you. Two things about that. One is, every colonial power treated the people living in their colonies differently. And the one thing that the French did that was different than anybody else is while they were still racist and they still, gave preference to French people, if you were a Senegalese, you were part of what's called the Greater Francophonie, or the Greater Society of France. And so there was a little bit more acceptance for Africans and other colonists during the war. I think with regards to getting their independence, I think you see that at the end of the Second World War, because the French Empire and the British Empire no longer have the capability of dictating what happens in their colonies. And so I'm sure that there were African veterans from the First World War who spoke out asking for independence or a little bit more freedom or a little bit more of an ability to go ahead and take care of their daily lives. But France, I think at the end of the war, just wanted to go back to business as usual and kind of shut that down. That would be my attempt at an answer. Thank you.
Thanks. Mike, I have another question.
Sir.
Do you see the French support for the American troops as being much better than it was for their African troops? The blacks.
Yeah. I got to think, I've got to go back to, I was reading Persian's description of his efforts during the war. And if I remember correctly, I want to think that they probably treated the African American soldiers a little bit better because they wanted to ensure that Pershing provided more bodies or more soldiers to the French. I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but during the German offensive of 1918, France was really only a couple of days, I think, away from a total collapse with regards to having enough soldiers to fill the gaps in the front lines. And so I'm sure the French and the British probably, while not giving a preferential treatment, probably ensured that they got everything that they needed, that they could get to American forces that may be serving alongside or serving for British units, just so that we would continue to put soldiers or units into to back up those particular units. If anybody else has done any research on that, I'd be interested on their take on that as well. All right, yeah, it's funny. I didn't either, but it makes the question is I don't know about the thousands of Africans sent to France to support factories. Yeah, it was kind of a gee whiz. That's should be a no-brainer sort of situation. The Frenchmen are being enlisted into the military and into the army to fight. Somebody's got to do those jobs because the crops aren't going to get planted by themselves and not going to be harvested. And I don't think all of the French women would be able to do all of that. Obviously, one thing I've learned from the Silk and Steel exhibit is that French women supported the war effort, everything from, making uniforms to working in the factories as well. So yeah, that was pretty good.
Mike, I do have one thing that surprised me a bit. You said that this particular war didn't set off any sort of independence movement, and that really didn't occur until after World War II. And I find that a little surprising because certainly in Southeast Asia, the independence movement was actually stimulated by World War I. But I suppose that there are two things. The North Africans, many of whom regarded themselves as actually part of France, were treated from a governmental standpoint, were treated much more like French states than they were like French colonies. And I suppose in the Senegalese, there simply wasn't an indigenous revolutionary movement to plug into, as there probably was in Vietnam.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's a good point. I mean, Algeria was considered to be the 13th province, or not province, 13th part of greater, sorry?
Département.
Yeah, a part of Paris. I mean, it was considered to be part of that. So I think, if I remember correctly, the French had a little bit of trouble at the beginning of the Second World War trying to convince North Africans to fight again. Again, I think probably maybe, as you say, maybe because the North African soldiers, veterans of the First World War, were looking for a little bit more independence, and then France just treated them like it went back to business as usual. So I mean, like I said, if I remember correctly, they had to do some fancy talking to North Africans to get them to fight in the Second World War. I think the other things, and I didn't do any research on this, and so I'm going from memory. So if I don't have it right, please somebody correct me. But if those first series of League of Nations meetings, there were a lot of folks attended that, speaking out for independence, at which point both the British and the French could completely ignore them. I mean, I didn't see if Ho Chi Minh came back to the first League of Nations, but the first premier of North Korea, he was supposedly at one of the League of Nations meetings. I'm sure there's a lot of other Asian leaders that we'll find later on after the Second World War who participated in that first or second League of Nations meetings asking for independence. But like I said, I think the English and the French just wanted to go back to the way it was. I mean, both of them, if you look at what they did during the interwar years, they both wanted to forget the experience altogether. But I could be wrong.
Anyone else?
Sorry.
Anyone else want to comment?
All right. So I got some references, folks. I mean, most of these were included in the handouts that I gave you. Interestingly enough, last week I came upon the Phoenix of Colonial War, Raced in the Laurel Whore on the Rhine, and Violent Images of African Colonial Troops. Both of those I ended up finding last week. And they actually talked a lot about the Schwarze Schmack, and then how the Germans were terrified because the French essentially highlighted the warlike images of the African soldiers. And then second, there's a couple more articles as well. And so I'll open up one last time. Any other questions, follow-on thoughts, concerns, considerations? If not, I will say thank you very much for your kind attention to this presentation.
All right. Well, Mike, thank you very much. This has been a very illuminating lecture and a very good one. I think it's an aspect of the war that most people don't talk about, but it's a very useful one to keep in mind. And thank you for getting all of that together and sharing it with us.